So yeah, if I had to break down Endgame into 10 of what I consider to be the most shocking or the most epic reveals, the first thing I would have to say is the opening of this film takes off running. It hits the ground running. Let's put it that way. With the last Avenger film and kind of the way it has been through a lot of these movies, the last 10 years has all been building up to the Infinity War. And even with the Infinity Gauntlet movie that we just saw last year, a lot of it wasn't necessarily action-packed right away. They had a lot of build-up. Now, the second half of that movie is pretty awesome as far as action. They do have a pretty good opening sequence in New York where Thanos' troops come down, and you have that little fight scene with Doctor Strange and Iron Man where they first meet. But then a lot of the movie is kind of build-up. Well, Endgame pulls no punches. I can tell you within the first 10 minutes of the film, here's everything that happens. The Avengers get together. I believe, Captain Marvel shows up with Tony Stark in tow. No doubt. We'll get to that in a minute, but there's a huge thing between Tony and Captain Marvel that they tie up the end of the last film with. It's really awesome. But the point I'm making with this is that within 10 minutes of the film, they assemble, they fly to the planet that you last see Thanos on, they kick his ass, and then they kill him. Yeah. 10 minutes into this movie, Thanos dies. I mean, that was some balls, I gotta say. And it was, for you Thor fans, Thor cuts his head off with a friggin' axe chop. So epic and so fast, it was almost over before you knew it. You didn't even realize what was happening. That's how quick it happened. So they pulled no punches right away. They dropped you into this film and said, look, this is going to be a 3-hour movie. We are going to have a middle section that's a little bit slower. It's kind of a build-up. We have a lot of ground to cover, and we're going to try to cover that as best we can here in these next 9 entries. We're going to do 10 total. But the first 5 to 10 minutes of the film, action-packed. It's awesome. Then it jumps ahead 5 years and it kind of shows the fallout of what the Avengers are dealing with and how a lot of them are not really handling it well. We'll get into that here in a minute. But the second thing that, if I had to talk about as far as a reveal is concerned, is something that was not really a reveal, because let's face it, everybody knew that time travel was going to play a big part in this film. It's probably the worst kept secret of Marvel going into this movie. I think everybody had a pretty good idea or had some theory about time travel. And it's really funny the way they set it up, because it has to do with Ant-Man's character in the quantum realm, and we all kind of saw that coming, and they set that up a good deal of that in Ant-Man versus Wasp in 2018. But what's funny about it is that they kind of set it up to where they even specifically mention films like Back to the Future and Terminator and all the normal time travel elements in those films in sci-fi that you know. And they basically say, look, none of that in this universe works. You can't, in the Marvel universe, their rules are you can't go back in time and change the past in order to affect the future. So right there, one of the biggest fan theories that everybody was throwing around, they killed it right away. They basically took the fan theory that everybody has been, working on for the last year. They just crumpled it up and threw it away. And they're just like, nope, that's not how it's going to work. What we have to do is we have to go back in time into the events of the previous films, because what they're looking to do is recreate the Infinity Gauntlet. And I'll tell you why that's important here in a minute. You might just say, well, why can't they just get the Infinity Gauntlet that Thanos has? Well, just wait. So they have to literally figure out where the Infinity Stones exist in the previous timeline, jump back into the previous films at earlier time periods, gather up the previous stones, and then try to bring them into their timeline, use them in order to accomplish their goals, and then return them to the previous timelines before anything gets out of whack. It's crazy. And in doing that, it's really cool because you get a lot of opportunities to now see characters from the previous films that we've spent the last decade with interacting with the future versions of themselves, and a lot of characters, because, you know, it's time travel, so a lot of characters that were either killed off in previous films or maybe we haven't seen for years and years are brought back. It's almost like a huge Marvel mega mix of characters. I mean, there's a reason why this is 3 hours, because they had a lot to pack into it. But the time travel element is really cool, but it's not actually handled in the way you'd expect. The third thing that I really enjoyed about the film, and the several reveals, have to do with two main characters, obviously Tony and Steve, Iron Man and Captain America. Both of these characters, because they're kind of the two original OG Marvel favorites of at least of the cinematic universe, they both get kind of a highlight in this film. And so we're going to talk about Tony's kind of highlights in as our number 3, and then we're also going to talk about Captain America's highlights, which even surpass Tony's. But a lot of really cool things is the fact that I want to go back and mention something earlier. So we were talking about Captain Marvel and the opening of the film, and we talk about how within the first 10 minutes of the film, they literally kill Thanos. Before that, you might wonder, how does Iron Man factor into that? How is he saved? We see in the previews that he's pretty much going to die on his ship, and nobody really explains or knows, how does he survive that? Does he survive that? I thought maybe they were going to be dealing with a past version of Tony or something like that. Maybe he didn't make it home, because it seemed impossible. How could one man on a ship with no fuel out in the middle of nowhere in the galaxy make it all the way back to Earth? It would take a savior of superhero proportions to do that. And that's exactly what happened. So they actually introduce Captain Marvel in the film saving Tony. He's literally about to drift away. He's given up. He's going to die. He does his little recording scene to Pepper that we see in the preview, and he's done. He's actually on the ship with Nebula, and it looks like he's pretty much a goner. He's done. And out of nowhere, Captain Marvel shows up, literally tows his ship back to Earth. So yeah, it's basically Captain Marvel that saves him. Now, the other thing, because I have a note here about Tony, I just want to make sure I cover everything. One scene from the previous film that's kind of it's almost a tearjerker. It gets you. It's something that you wanted to see for Tony. He hinted at the fact that he's ready for kids. He maybe wanted to have kids in the previous film. He does finally end up having a child with Pepper. So essentially what happens when Captain Marvel brings him back, this is, let's see, I'm trying to remember the timeline. So they're about 20 days out from the previous film when Captain Marvel saves him. So they bring him in. He's part of the crew. Actually, he's not part of the crew that goes and fights Thanos, because he's so emaciated. He's literally, when they find him, and this, I give props to Robert Downey Jr. For doing an incredible performance in this particular scene at the beginning, as well as the CG. They use CG similar to the way that they did with Chris Evans in the original Captain America, where he filmed all of his scenes, and as you know, he's a big buff guy. He had to get pumped up. Well, they had to do the scenes where he was the young, scrawny runt, so they just CG'd him down to look puny. They pretty much did the same thing with Robert Downey Jr. By the time that they pull him off the ship, he's just completely... He's shriveled up. He's weak. He's thin. They look like they CG'd about 40, 50 pounds off of him. And he's kind of crazy, actually. He's desperate. He's still kind of freaked out about the whole, the loss to Thanos. He blames himself for the loss of Peter Parker. And so when he finally meets face to face with Cap again, it's not a good meeting. You think maybe the tension is just going to go away and they're going to be buddies and that's it. No, it's a really tense scene, and he wants nothing to do with any of them. So they go off, they do their thing with Thanos, but then they realize that killing him didn't really solve anything. They obviously go there in the first place to get his gauntlet, to get the Infinity Stones, because essentially Captain Marvel thinks that she's just going to throw the glove on, do a second snap, reverse everything will be fine. It doesn't play out quite that way, but I can tell you by the end of that, Thanos is done. He's toast. And then they flash forward the 5 years. So you see Tony picking up the pieces of his life, and he kind of got lucky. The one person that he really cares about, Pepper, didn't vanish in the snap. They end up settling down next to a lake. It's, Tony's known for his big lavish mansions and his skyscrapers and his millions of dollars and his tech. We see him here. He's a very different guy. He's out in the woods. He's living by a lake. It's a very low-tech existence. He has his wife. They have a little girl now, and he's just kind of basically kicking back and kind of doing his family life thing, and that's what he wants. So that was really nice that they kind of showed a different side of Tony, and his whole mission in the film is to try to undo everything Thanos did without losing everything he's gained in the meantime. And that's kind of tricky, and it doesn't necessarily work out that way. We'll talk about that here in a minute. The other thing that we find out about Tony throughout the course of the film is that Doctor Strange's plan to give Thanos the Time Stone only had in part to do with the Avengers winning the battle. There's a huge part of Tony in Doctor Strange's plan, and he still has a huge part to play by the end of the film that has more to do with just fighting Thanos or getting the Infinity Stones and just trying to win the battle. You'll find out later in the stream as I get to that part. Tony has a bigger part to play in that. Now, a really fun thing about this film that I did not see coming, and it's one of those things where I almost wish I didn't know about the comic aspect of this. But when they introduce Bruce's character, he's neither Bruce Banner or the Hulk. He's this hybrid of the two. And if you remember in the last film, it was all Bruce. We haven't seen Hulk since Thor Ragnarok. He wouldn't... Well, actually, we saw him a little bit at the beginning of Infinity War, but then that's it. He won't come out during the battles, and there's this back and forth between he and Bruce can't figure it out. Well, in the comics, there's a version of the Hulk where Bruce is able to kind of merge the most intelligent parts of himself with the physical strength of the Hulk and be the balance, the good hybrid between the two, where he's not this crazy rage monster and he's not the puny, short scientist. He's the best of both worlds. That's literally him from now on. And to be honest, I don't think, based on what we see in the film, I don't think you get to see human Bruce Banner anymore. He essentially says that he got tired of seeing the Hulk as this side effect. He realized that the only way he can really live his life is to truly coexist with the Hulk side of himself. So he literally uses gamma radiation. He says he did a lot of research to finally merge the two sides. Now, the image that you see here is from the first Avengers film. I couldn't find a good image of it because obviously there's no way to really get a screen cap of what he looks like in this film, other than maybe off of like a bootleg, which I didn't want to do that. So essentially, imagine what he looks like here in this box right there, but with like glasses, and he essentially looks like a perfect CG version of the Hulk with Mark Ruffalo's face. It's funny, and he's not like this crazy unintelligent creature, because in Thor Ragnarok, Hulk does talk and he communicates, but he's like dull. He's a kind of big brute, and he doesn't have much intelligence. In this film, it's the complete opposite. It's a really cool version of the Hulk. He does a lot of really cool Bruce Banner science-y type stuff, but then he also is he's the Hulk. It's a really good version. It's nice to bring it full circle. There's only so much you can do, I think, with the Hulk character in its previous form. So I think this is a really cool way that they set him up for some really epic and heroic moments later on. And there's a scene later where it's absolutely necessary for Bruce to have both his intelligence and his strength as the Hulk to do what he needs to do later in the film. So it was really good that they brought that comic element in. Now let's talk about Captain Marvel a little bit. Now, everybody had theories about Captain Marvel, especially with the recent film coming out. Everyone knew that there was going to be a showdown between her and Thanos and a confrontation. Now, a lot of people wrongly assumed that it was Captain Marvel that was going to be the savior of this film. That she is going to be the ultimate badass. She is going to be the one that literally takes on Thanos, undoes everything, and she is going to be the star of the film. Now, I can tell you this. Was she a badass in this movie? Yes. Did she look awesome doing all the things that she did? Absolutely. Was she the hero? Was she even that big? Did she play that big of a role? Nah. Maybe. A little bit. She had her moments. Now, don't get me wrong. When she did take on Thanos, she fights Thanos 2 different occasions. One at the beginning of the film, and once she makes a pretty big impact in one of the battles at the end of the film. Having said that, I can honestly say Captain Marvel did not defeat Thanos. She did not in any way save Earth from Thanos. She wasn't the savior of the film. She wasn't the hero that everybody thought she was going to be. That's not to take anything away from the character. My wife and I, my wife really loves Brie Larson in this role. She loves the Captain Marvel character. I like the Captain Marvel character as well. I love the last movie. I know a lot of people hated on that film for a lot of stupid reasons. The movie was great. She was great in it. It was a good movie. She was good in it. And Captain Marvel is a great character. It's a fun character. I like her. But she just didn't play the role in this film that everybody thought she did, or that everybody thought she would. It's not to say she wasn't awesome, because she was, but it was almost a swerve. I feel like we got bait and switched a little bit. But that's okay, because there was a lot of other really cool scenes. And she played her part perfectly. She had a new look in the film. At the beginning of the film, she's like OG classic Captain Marvel look from the last film. And then as the timeline progresses, we have a different look where she cuts her hair off a little shorter. I'm sure that's in reference to one of her many looks that she has in the comics, but overall, it was a welcome addition. It was cool seeing her do her thing. But yeah, not as much of an influence in the overall plot of the film as I thought she would be. Now we're going to talk about something that, speaking of fan theories and what a lot of people said going into the movie. There was a lot of speculation about the deaths in this movie. Who was going to be brought back? Who's actually dead, like officially or permanently? I can tell you that there is a small amount of people that did not make it out alive, and they are actually dead. And this is not speculation. This is literally people that either weren't brought back at all, or they flat out say, look, these people are not coming back for this reason. It has to do with the Soul Stone. In one instance, I know you're thinking Gamora, but there's another one. And there's a couple other people that they just don't address because their deaths were unrelated to the snap, meaning they can't really be brought back in that way. So after it's all said and done, once we get back some of the Avengers that we lost in the film, and I don't think that's, even though this is spoiler heavy stream, it's not spoilerish to say that a lot of the Avengers that we lost in the last film are back. I mean, that's obvious. I mean, you can look at trailers that they have made for upcoming films or movies that they have announced that they're working on. That obviously suggests that they're going to have to bring some people back. But I can tell you this. We'll go down the list here. Loki is legit dead, not coming back. Thanos choked him out and killed him. So our version of Loki is gone. But there might be another version. Talk about that here in a minute. Gamora, again, original Gamora is still dead because it has to do with the Soul Stone. We do get Gamora back because of the time jumping element. So, as I mentioned, a lot of our current timeline characters that jumped back in time, it also worked in reverse. Some of the previous characters from the other timeline in the past jump ahead into our future, which means we do get Gamora back, but it's a different version. It's the previous version. I think it's pre-Guardians of the Galaxy or right around that timeline, so she doesn't have any of the memories or the feelings between her and Quill, which makes for a really funny scene between them later. We have evil Nebula now, even though the new Nebula is helping the Avengers and she's turned and she's a good guy now. We have her previous version, which is evil, who helps Thanos. But yeah, OG Gamora still gone because it has to do with her being locked up in the Soul Stone, and you don't get those people back no matter what happens, no matter what snaps happen. The other version of Nebula that I just mentioned, she bites it. So the new Nebula stays, old Nebula, old meaning original from the original timeline, the one that jumps forward, she gets killed. Vision is still dead. Scarlet Witch even kind of mentions that because she has a little, when she's brought back later on and has a second face-off with Thanos, she pretty much references the fact that, he took everything away from her. And my wife even leaned over to me in the movie and said, so can Vision come back now? And I had to think about it because I'm like, well, really, there's no reason he couldn't. But I forgot that we're actually 5 years, by that point in the film, we're 5 years ahead in the timeline in the future, post Infinity War events. And if you remember, Thanos just rips the Mind Stone right out of his skull, and being that he's mostly cybernetic, that just, whatever was Vision in that, wrapped up in that, was destroyed. So there's really no way to bring him back. Now, we were talking about the Soul Stone. And the reason why Gamora can't come back is because she's locked up with the original snap from the first film. Any of the soul people, the people that are killed as a result, that are sacrificed as a result of getting the Soul Stone, can't come back. So that's OG Gamora. Well, you have to remember, they go back in time to acquire the Soul Stones. It is Hawkeye and Black Widow who are tasked. Their mission is to get the Soul Stone in the secondary timeline. They have to get the second version. The problem is, it's the same setup as before. They meet up with Red Skull again on the planet where Thanos went and sacrificed Gamora. It's the same problem as before. The gods or the protectors of the Soul Stone require a sacrifice. And there's this really funny scene where they both go back and forth fighting and arguing over who's going to sacrifice themselves in order to get the stone, because Clint is kind of off the rails because of his family disappearing in the snap, which you see at the beginning of the film. He's completely went off the deep end. He's just started killing. He's basically turned into Batman. He started a vigilante killing any criminals that he can find, and he's traveling the world doing that. So he has no family, he has no wife, no kids. He's just basically turning into this killing machine. And he essentially wants to die. He wants to sacrifice himself. The problem is, Natasha feels the exact same way. She hasn't been able to really keep herself together. She doesn't know what to do. It's 5 years later. She doesn't know how to cope with their situation. She doesn't have anything. She doesn't have any family, doesn't have any friends. She's basically just the ones that are left. She's not really, as far as she's concerned, her only goal is to undo things. And if her sacrifice can do that, then she wants to do it. So they have this back and forth, and it's actually this really emotional scene where Clint finally, they kind of roll around, they go back and forth. Clint finally gets himself over the mountain, and he's falling. Problem is, here comes Natasha again, boom, grabs him, attaches herself to this wire, she kind of shoots it up, so that you have this scene where Clint is hanging from the cliff, and now he has Natasha, and he's trying to hold on to her. He's desperately trying to save her. He knows he can't. she essentially talks him into it, but she basically is telling him, look, let me go. It's okay. She does kind of this like backflip thing where he can't hold her. And so she finally wiggles away and sacrifices herself. And she's actually the one that is able to acquire the Soul Stone for Hawkeye. He does the same thing that Thanos did. He wakes up in the pool. He looks down in his hand. He opens it, and there's the Soul Stone. So she legit, unfortunately, is not coming back. That's going to kind of throw a monkey wrench into some plans that Marvel has later on, or maybe they have some plans on how to get out of that, which we'll talk about that in another area here momentarily. But yeah, Black Widow, I was kind of bummed to see her go because she's an OG Avenger. I always really liked her character. I always liked her better than Hawkeye, but in this film, Hawkeye is really cool. I mean, I got to say, so to me, it could have went either way. Had Hawkeye been the one to go over the cliff, I would have been probably equally as bummed out. The biggest, most impactful death of the film, and this is one of the biggest spoilers that you may or may not have read online yet, but in fact, Tony is on the death list. I'm sorry to say. We will talk about here in a minute exactly how that goes down, but literally Tony sacrifices himself in a move that wins the battle for the entire cast. It essentially ends the film in a way that is pretty epic. It's pretty awesome in how they did that. But the point of it is Tony's gone. He's done. And it's a very emotional scene. It's not only emotional for the characters that are supposedly, friends with Tony. They're never going to see him again. Pepper, for example. I was kind of emotional myself as a fan because, I mean, you got to remember, this was, the guy that kind of took us on the ride for these, through these films from the start. So yeah, that kind of bummed me out that he didn't make it, especially the fact that they set it up that he finally has everything he wanted. He has a wife, he's safe, he's back home. He didn't think he was going to make it. He gets back. He doesn't know that he doesn't know if Pepper has been vanished by the Infinity Gauntlet in the last film. She's not. They finally have a kid together. He literally has everything he's ever wanted. And then by the end of the film, he's got to make the sacrifice. So of all the speculated deaths, there are about 5 or 6 that are legit characters that Marvel is essentially saying, look, we're pretty much done. We're pretty much done with these. Some of them, that's fine by me, because they can't really do much with them anyway. But for the most part, Tony, I'd say, is probably going to be the most impactful one. Now, there's one more character that I'll talk about here in a minute that actually doesn't he doesn't die necessarily, but his character is going to be done. We'll talk about that here in a second. But the next thing I want to talk about, and to me, this is one of the coolest aspects of this film. I love how Marvel takes concepts and ideas and kind of, you think going into a film that you might have an idea, but it's like Game of Thrones. You know nothing. You think you know, but you don't know. So one of the coolest and biggest aspects of the last film was leading up to the snap. Everybody remembers the snap, right? You go on Facebook, there's Facebook memes, you can buy the Infinity Gauntlet at Walmart and I was going to say Toys R Us, but they're not a thing anymore. But the snap was such a huge thing. It was this huge buildup. He kept getting one stone after another, and they kept saying if Thanos gets the glove and he puts the stone in it, he can end reality like that. And he does it. He does exactly what he said he was going to do. That was the big finale. And when it finally happened, we couldn't believe it. There are 3 snaps in this film. Marvel basically took what we loved about the last one and said, oh, you thought that was a big deal, huh? Well, guess what? We're going to do it 3 more times. And it's crazy to think, how can you have such an epic catastrophe, this universal thing, this event that has repercussions that ripple throughout the entire universe, and you're going to do it 3 more times in one film? But yes, they do that. Now, the first time, is something I was trying to talk around in the first part when I talk about the opening of the film, because I didn't want to give that away yet, even though we're talking about, pretty much all spoilers for this stream. When they basically track Thanos down at the beginning and they kill him, the reason why he dies, Thor is pissed, not only because, obviously he has an axe to grind, no pun intended. He wants to kill Thanos anyway. Essentially, the reason why they're able to find Thanos is because this huge energy signature goes off and has the same energy signature as the original snap. So that's how they're able to locate him on this planet that he's essentially retired to. What that energy signature was, believe it or not, was a second snap by Thanos. And he is essentially destroying his Infinity Gauntlet. We don't see it happen. It happens off screen. But when they show up, they literally, it's crazy. You see Thanos hanging out doing his farmer thing. He's like Farmer Thanos. He's picking crops and he's just he wants to be left alone. He did what he considers his job. And now he's just going to relax and do his thing. Within 2 minutes of the Avengers showing up at his little shack, they grab him, they kick his ass, and then Thor cuts his arm off. They literally cut the original gauntlet off his arm because they're going to take it from him and they're going to undo everything he did. And they have it, and you think, okay, well, this is actually going to be, what are they going to do here? Because they're clearly going to do this immediately. They're going to roll out this fan theory that everybody said, well, this is exactly what's going to happen. And it looks like they were going to do it within like the first 10 minutes. Well, the problem is the stones are gone. And the gauntlet is completely destroyed. It's like shriveled up. It's melted to his hand. And the other thing is Thanos is completely burnt up on the whole side of his face, which I thought originally was a continuity error. Because I remember thinking to myself, he didn't have these burns at the end of the last film. Well, the reason why is because he said it was too much of a temptation to keep the stones. That whether he or someone else would try to undo his work, he essentially did a second snap that destroyed their version of the stones. So the stones are gone. They don't exist anymore. That leads to the whole time travel storyline where they have to break up into teams and go into the past and find the different original versions of the stones at earlier points in the timeline and bring them forward. They do that. They're actually successful. They gather up all the original stones from all the original films and their locations. They bring them back. Now they have to build their own Infinity Gauntlet. And the funny thing about that is they essentially manufacture it out of what looks like an Iron Man hand. Tony Stark builds it in his lab. And so if you take a look at this Infinity Gauntlet in this frame right below me, imagine the Infinity Gauntlet, but like Iron Man. That's exactly what it looks like. And I was telling you before, the reason why they had to actually merge the brute strength of Hulk with Banner and his intelligence in order to set him up for this historic moment. That brings us to the second snap, because essentially now that they have the Infinity Stones, they're going to undo everything Thanos tried to do. Now, I assumed that maybe because they have the Time Stone in there as well, they were going to be able, they're going to turn back time and undo things. But it's very specific that Tony does not want to undo the last 5 years. As bad as it has been, that is when he started his family. He has a little girl now. He doesn't want to lose all of that. He just wants to bring everybody back into their current timeline. So that's Hulk's job. And he's the only one that can actually withstand the sheer force of the gauntlet. And he snaps. It almost kills him. He basically does the same thing to him that it did to Thanos, because even though he's strong, he's not quite as strong as Thanos. So his arm gets kind of mangled up. He gets burnt up. But it works. Hulk is able to bring everyone back with a snap of their new Infinity Gauntlet. But wait, there's more. I said there's 3. So that's 2 snaps. So right about this time is when past Thanos actually shows up in the future, and that has to do with a plot point with the evil Nebula coming through. The original Nebula is captured. She kind of plays herself off as the current timeline one, and is able to essentially bring past Thanos forward in time in order to wage a new war. Essentially the war that he would have waged in the original Infinity War. It's accelerated to where he has to jump into the future now to do it, because he has seen the events unfold in the future. He realizes that the snap that he did is actually not good enough. Wiping out half the galaxy apparently didn't work, because he sees that he ultimately dies. It also leads to what the Avengers' plan is of getting the Infinity Stones and undoing everything. And he's like, well, you know what? I know. I'm glad I have a second chance, because now I'm going to do it the right way. So his plan is to jump into the future, into our timeline, where we already have the stones waiting for him. So he doesn't have to go on this stone quest for 5-6 movies. We already have all the stones together in this new Infinity Gauntlet that Tony built and the Hulk just used. So he's just going to grab that, and he's going to wipe out. His plan now is to wipe out everybody in the galaxy. He literally says to Tony, I see the error of my ways. It was a mistake to wipe out half the galaxy. I'm going to destroy all life, and then I'm going to create new life after that. That way, no one ever knows what existed before this. So no one tries to undo my work anymore. And that's essentially what the last battle is about. So the invasion that you saw essentially in the first Avengers and Infinity War, with all of his troops and all of his firepower, is now brought down. He invades Earth, and it's this huge, it's this epic battle. It's a huge fight scene between all of Thanos' forces and all of the returned Avengers. So we essentially have, I don't think you could have a bigger battle scene in any Marvel movie. I don't know how much longer they're going to keep making Marvel movies. I know they have the next phase and the next phase, and obviously they're not going to stop, because they just bought Fox, which means we still have the X-Men movies that they're going to remake. They're going to do Fantastic Four. There's a lot of the existing Marvel characters that they haven't really fleshed out all the way yet. We're going to see more Black Panther. We're going to see more Spider-Man. There's a lot of Avengers left to work with that we either haven't seen, or some of them that haven't really they haven't done much with yet. So it's one of those things where I don't know how long this is going to continue, but if they do a bigger fight scene than this, I would be surprised. I don't see how they can possibly do it. Because when Thanos' army lands and he's trying to get the new Infinity Gauntlet, while this is going on, Doctor Strange essentially brings every Avenger that existed in the previous film that is now back. We're talking Black Panther and all of Wakanda's forces. We're talking all the wizards. We're talking everybody. And it's this huge battle. And I actually thought the movie was going to end there, because you had thousands of forces on either side. And I'm thinking there's no way that this battle is going to be too epic. They can't show this. How are they going to deal with this? They've built this up so high, it can't go anywhere. This is probably going to cut away, or something's going to happen. It happened. It was a huge 20-minute battle of just about every Marvel character you could think of that you have seen up till now versus all of Thanos' forces, and it was awesome. I can't give Marvel props enough. Which brings us, again, I'm finally getting to it, because I needed to set that up, to the third snap. The reason I told you all of that is to tell you this. Tony, with the help of Captain Marvel, she does make an appearance there, and she helps get the gauntlet, because Thanos does get the gauntlet again, and it looks like he's basically going to repeat his victory from the last film. And there's a point where it looks like he's not going to get it, and then he puts it on, and you're like, oh crap, what's going to happen now? He got the gauntlet again. But Captain Marvel does make the save. I just feel like, for those that have seen the scene and know how Captain Marvel kind of swoops in and does her thing, I feel like that could have been a lot of other characters that did the same thing. I feel like Thor was pulling his weight, so to speak, no pun intended. Those of you that seen the film, you know why that's funny. Because he's heavy now. Thor basically gets a beer gut and dreadlocks because he's depressed and doesn't want to. He gets really down by not being able to save everybody. So that was really funny how they essentially had this hunk of a man that they keep talking about in the last film, specifically how he's a real man compared to everyone else. He's a god in every sense of the way, except in this film he looks like he's a guy that just drinks beer and watches too much NASCAR. He looks like the Big Lebowski, and then Tony Stark, of course, even calls him that in the film. But by the end, he gets his stuff together. He's good. He's good by the end of the film. So I feel like he could have played the role of what Captain Marvel brought to the table in some regards. And, Doctor Strange was doing his thing. There was a lot of fighting going on there with his powers, and Spider-Man was doing his thing. So Captain Marvel, I feel like maybe got overshadowed a little bit just because there was so much going on in this battle and just in the film. But that's what happens when you mash up this many epic characters and this much power in one film. So when she's in her own standalone film that takes place in the 90s where there's not a lot going on, she's a lot more impressive on her own. When she's in a movie with, 20 other Avengers or something like that, I feel like she got lost in the shuffle a little bit. But back to the snap. The third snap comes when Tony finally realizes that the only way that they're going to win, even though the Avengers are doing their thing and they're fighting, he essentially has to be the one that will get the Infinity Gauntlet and essentially vaporize both Thanos and his forces. This takes us back to Doctor Strange. He kind of teased in a few scenes earlier in the film that Tony had a part to play yet in his plan in the versions of the timeline that Doctor Strange saw, and he saw however many thousands of different timelines. There was one version that they won, and it had specifically to do with Tony. The reason Tony had to survive is because Tony ultimately has to be the one that sacrifices himself by grabbing the gauntlet and doing the snap. Now, we've already seen how it affects Thanos, and Thanos can barely contain it when he does it, and he uses it. And he can wield the stones and the power, but because he's a powerful person. Hulk almost couldn't do it. You see the second snap in the film, and he's able to maintain, but it takes a lot out of him. For just a regular, normal person, the Infinity Stones are instant death, or almost instant death, and that's essentially what Tony does. So he does a third snap, and what I love about that snap is what you see at the end of Infinity War, where Thanos essentially has all of the heroic good guy characters slowly vanishing one at a time. And if you think back to what a shocking scene that was, and nobody saw that coming, and you see all these iconic characters just one by one starting to disappear. Now imagine that exact scene, but flipped on the bad guys. So you see all of these ships and all of these thousands of legions of bad guys all start deteriorating. And Thanos is just sitting there looking around, realizing that he's won, realizing that he's lost, that there's no way he's going to win. And I thought that maybe they were going to leave him, he wasn't going to die. Maybe he would be one of the people that, because not all of the Avengers in the first film that vanished, half of them vanished, half of them didn't. I thought maybe they're going to keep him around, but they kept him around just long enough so that he could see he has completely failed now a second time. Even though he was victorious in the first version, he got killed, and the Avengers was able to kind of undo his plan. This second Thanos from the past, the second version that wanted to do round 2 of his snap, he realizes that that's not going to happen anyway. It's done. His plans have failed again, and he kind of slowly starts to disappear, and he finally disappears too. Which you can add him, by the way, to the death list from earlier. So not only does he get his head chopped off in the first 10 minutes of the film, then he dies a second time. So technically, we got 2 Thanos deaths in one film. So if you like the snap, if you thought the snap was epic in the first film, as I did, and I'm sure a lot of other people do as well, to have 3 different ones in this film, I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing now that I think about it, because does it make it that much more epic that you have 3 different versions of the snap, or does it take away from the fact that the snap was so ridiculously cool in the last one, and it was so hyped and they built up to it, and now they did it 3 more times. I'm gonna have to think about that. I'm not sure, but yeah, it was crazy. By the third time, I'm just thinking like they can't do anything more with the Infinity Stones. They have done everything you can possibly do with an Infinity Stone, and fortunately, by the end of the film, now they do get them all back together. They get them back to the original timelines, and that's a nice way that they wrap up this whole Infinity Gauntlet saga, the storyline, because it could have really it's like I've said with the original film. I didn't know what to think going into the first Infinity War movie, because to me it should have collapsed under its own weight. Like the sheer volume of stuff that they had to juggle in that film should not have worked, yet it did. This movie is essentially Infinity War on steroids. Everything you loved about that movie, it's pumped, or some of the previous films. Like, I feel like the Avengers have done a good job of taking the individual movies, like the in-between sequels, and then making them into kind of a spectacle, a pumped-up version of the other ones. And then each Avengers film was bigger than the last. Infinity War, up until now, has obviously been the biggest spectacle we've had. But when you see Endgame, which I assume either you have by now, if you're watching this stream, or you're going to maybe see it this weekend, or whenever you do see it, I promise you, if you liked Infinity War, you're going to friggin' love Endgame, for sure. It will not disappoint. Now, speaking of that, we have to talk about where do we go from here, which is our next point. Marvel has already teased some upcoming films. Obviously, Spider-Man is going to be coming out, I think, in about 2 months, maybe 3 months. I think it's slated for July. So they had to do something to get that back on track. They also just had one of their biggest successes of any Marvel film, which was kind of an unexpected success in a lot of ways. I don't think anybody saw Black Panther, just how well received that film was going to be. And that actually that's one of the highest grossing Marvel films that they did. Obviously, they're going to make a sequel to that movie, but then they kill off Black Panther in the last Infinity War movie. So with the undoing of the snap, they bring back Spider-Man, they bring back Black Panther, so that kind of resets things for those movies. What it doesn't do is it complicates the Black Widow film that I know has been announced. They've already talked about how they want to work with Scarlett Johansson on some kind of Black Widow project. Now, being that it's comic book movies and that nobody's really dead for long, you can always write them out of death if you had to. It wouldn't be a big deal. They did it with Coulson. The character Coulson, who dies in, I think, the first Avengers film, but then shows back up on the S.H.I.E.L.D. TV show, and they just kind of, they explain that away. They have a little explanation about how they bring him back from the dead, but it's really not, it's no big thing to write that away. So they could easily bring Black Widow back somehow if they really wanted to, or maybe they could deal with alternate timelines or whatever the case may be. Or maybe have they decided to shelve the Black Widow project? I'm not sure. I'm not even sure what stage in development is actually in currently. But we'll see. We'll see if the Black Widow film or TV show or whatever it is, whatever they were working on, we'll see if that actually happens. Now, it would be interesting to see if maybe that was kind of a sly way of them kind of shelving that project because they have too much on their plate and they figure that a standalone Black Widow movie probably wouldn't be something that's going to do terribly well at the box office. I'm a fan of the character, but I don't know that I need to see her in her own film. But we'll see. I don't know. The other thing, though, is the Loki, I believe it's TV series that has just been announced for the streaming service that's coming up. Now, obviously, they announced that after Infinity War, where it seemed that Loki was very dead. And they went out of their way to show you that this is not, he's not being a trickster. This is nothing. I know a lot of fan theories talked about how it wasn't really, it was maybe a projection of Loki or he faked his death and blah, blah, blah. I mean, it was pretty obvious to me that after so many fake deaths in the past, he was legit gone at the end of that, or at the beginning of the last film. And so when they announced that, you wonder, well, how they're going to do that? Well, in the film here, you see that because of the time travel elements, they kind of screw up some things about the timeline, so things aren't quite synced up with the events that we remember. For instance, they go back into the first Avengers film, which was spoiled for me actually last year when I saw Infinity War, because I had seen the behind-the-scenes photos of the new characters in the original film's location. So instantly I thought, well, okay, they have to do something with time travel or something if they're going back and talking to their original characters. But what they do is when they go back into the first film, and it's right as Loki is actually captured, Captain America and Tony Stark completely screw up the timeline. And now, instead of being captured by the end of the first Avengers film, Loki actually grabs the Tesseract and escapes. And so he's just gone. And that, I assume, is how they got out of the whole killing him in the last film. So probably, if I had to guess, the new film is going to deal with that version of Loki, or that timeline's version of Loki, where he's now off on his own again, doing his own thing, probably using the Tesseract to hop around the galaxy and do whatever he needs to do. So that's probably, I assume, specifically the reason they wrote that scene in. And it's kind of just a throwaway scene. It leads to something else where it pushes the plot forward with specifically Tony and Steve Rogers, who then have to go back in time, and it's to the 70s. They have to meet up with a version of Tony Stark's dad and a young version of Michael Douglas as the original Ant-Man, if you can believe it. That's how crazy this film is. That everything you could think that to throw as a comic book fan into this version of, this mishmashed versions of what if, and this character and that character, and different versions of characters, it's all in there. I mean, this was a love letter to Marvel fans and comic book fans. So it was really cool how they did that. And the other thing is, what do you do with the Thor character? Because he's kind of ran his course. There's not much left for him to do. So last we see him, he hooks up with the Guardians of the Galaxy, and it's this fun sequence between him and Quill at the end, and they're trying to figure out who's the actual leader now and the captain of the ship. And he actually calls them the Asgardians of the Galaxy. So was that just a funny little throwaway thing, or are we going to see a new Guardians movie, maybe as Thor as a secondary character or as a guest character? I assume they'll do another Guardians film. I can't imagine they're done with that. They did two. I think a lot of people actually say that they like the second Guardians film a little bit better than the first one. I don't know. I think I might like the first one better personally, but I think they probably have one more Guardians of the Galaxy film in there somewhere. And I think now Quill, if I'm remembering the timeline right, I don't know if I'm getting all of the big event. I'm covering the big stuff, but there might be a few little things here and there that I'm forgetting. Like I said, I'm fresh off of the film. Literally walked out of the theater straight home. I didn't walk home. I mean, I walked straight in here when I got home to do the stream. I should have walked home. It would have gave me time to collect my thoughts, because there's just so much going on. I wish you could see my desk right now. I have so many Post-its with notes and things of all the points I wanted to cover. It's just crazy. But yeah, there's a lot going on with it, and it'll be funny to see how they kind of tie all that up. And again, the other thing about these the points that we're making here, like I said, I want this to be kind of a reveal video of the top 10 things that I thought were interesting. This is by no means an Easter egg reveal video. There's probably so many little small tidbits and things that I'm sure I overlooked that I'll have to catch, when I go back to see it. I might see it again in the theater, I'm not sure, but I'm sure I'll see it a bunch of times when it hits streaming and on demand. So, but it'll be interesting to see, do they do another Guardians film? And if they do, what do they do with the Thor character? Now we get to the Captain America kind of highlight reel portion of the stream. We talked a lot about Tony and a lot of the cool things that happened with him. And as I mentioned with Tony's section, they really paid extra attention to give everybody that had anything to do with the original Avengers crew kind of their own spotlight. There's a scene, or not a scene, but in the credits at the end, they show pretty much all of the Avengers, the title cards. But when they get to the original Avengers, like the OG crew from the first movie, they do this really cool thing where like they have these special signatures that they did, and they have like their titles and and a nice little shot of each person individually. And that was a nice callback and tribute to the original Avengers. And they did something similar within the film with the plot, specifically with Tony and Steve Rogers, because of them being the original characters. And I think as cool as, or as happy as you are for Tony and a lot of the really interesting things that you get to see from him, Captain America fans are gonna love the references and everything they do with Captain America in this movie. This is, he's probably got easily the 2 or 3 coolest moments in the film. And I'll rattle off just a couple of them. So the first thing is that the Civil War storyline from the Marvel movie Civil War, that's finally resolved. Even though when Tony and Steve first meet at the beginning of the film, they're still not friends. Not only do they finally make up, they finally put to bed all of that negativity from Civil War. Tony essentially rechristens Steve as Captain America again. He gives him back his shield, and it's because of Tony that Steve is able to once again become Captain America. So it's a really cool scene. It's right towards, I'd say maybe a third of the way in. It's when Tony finally helps figure out the time travel aspect of it, and he's going to help the Avengers before they start jumping back into the original films. He essentially turns him back into Captain America. So that was a really cool callback. Another callback that was awesome, if you remember in, I think it was Age of Ultron, so that would be the second Avengers film, where they're all taking turns trying to pick up the hammer. And you can see that Steve, when he goes to pick it up, he moves it a little bit. He doesn't pick it up, but it looks like, you can see Thor's face. He gets a little worried because he's afraid, like, oh man, I hope he doesn't pick it up, because that means he's worthy as well. Well, guess what? Captain America, absolutely worthy, because there's a scene where I won't get into specifics because, the stream's going a little bit longer, and I'm not gonna get into every single detail of the film, because you'll either already pick that up from watching it, or you'll see it when you watch it later on. Let me just say that Thor's hammer makes a return. This time, it's wielded by Captain America. In fact, his shield gets broken in the battle with Thanos. Thanos is the only one that's strong enough to shatter that vibranium shield. It doesn't matter, because the Thor's hammer essentially now becomes Captain America's new weapon. It's awesome. So, and during the whole battle, he's not only flinging it around, he's doing the whole he's summoning lightning. Captain America is using Thor's lightning during the battle. So it's a really fun scene, and Thor even kind of admits, like, okay, I always knew you were worthy. And it's a really interesting scene. It's really fun. I love the fact that they did that callback, and they actually show that this entire time he has been worthy. And I even think back to that scene, and now it makes me wonder about the Captain America scene from Avengers 2. Could he have actually picked up the hammer then? Was he just basically being nice, or trying to be cordial, or he didn't want to make Thor feel bad, so did he fake not being able to pick it up? I'm curious, but because I'm sure he was as worthy then as he is now. Another really fun scene is the fact that I mentioned that they make fun of Back to the Future in this film. I even clapped during those scenes in the theater, because Back to the Future is one of my favorite films. So any Back to the Future reference I love. And at one point, Steve actually goes around the corner in the previous timeline. They make a point to do not interact with anyone, do not speak to anybody, don't interfere with previous events. Well, of course, who is the first person to have the biggest screw up in the timeline? It's Captain America. He goes around the corner and bumps into himself from the first Avengers film. Now, the original Captain America thinks that he's Loki in disguise, because they're looking for Loki, because he had just escaped with the Tesseract. So there's this big fight scene between OG Captain America from the future and the past version of himself, who's still wearing the original helmet. Now, the future Captain America, we should note, has his original costume on, because he's trying to blend in with the Captain America from that timeline. He's trying not to draw attention to himself. So you have like the masked Captain America versus the future version without the mask, and they both have the shield and they're throwing it at each other and the shields are clanging off each other. It's just it's a fun scene. It's fan service at its best, and you gotta love Marvel for throwing in those little things. I mean, that's probably the kind of thing that if you wanted to cut this film down from 3 hours, that is probably the first thing that would get cut. It doesn't really, from what I remember, it doesn't really drive the plot forward. It's just a cool scene. But I'm glad it was in there. It's a fun movie and it's a fun scene, and I'm glad that they added that. And that's just a couple of the cool things that they did with Steve Rogers. They have another scene, if you remember, in it is not the Winter Soldier. What is it called? It's Captain America 2, basically. I think it's called Winter Soldier. Yeah, it's Winter Soldier. And it's that scene, they redo the scene where they're in the elevator, if you remember that, where he has to fight like 5 guys in the elevator that are secretly working for Hydra. It's not the same scene, but it's the same exact setup. It's those guys that come to collect all of the artifacts from the end of the first Avengers films for S.H.I.E.L.D. Well, the future Captain America has to get his hands on the Tesseract, on those Infinity Stones. So he gets in the elevator with them again, and you think they're going to have a second big fight scene because they're all wondering, what's going on? Why is he here? And they're about to attack him. You can see that they're getting ready to pull their guns, and then he leans in and says, "Hail Hydra," which is a direct reference to the comics, which is something that I really geeked out at that moment. A lot of people are not going to get that, why that's cool, unless you follow that specific storyline in the comics where I believe, I'm not sure if he's brainwashed or if it's it's like a pre-implanted command. I can't remember exactly how that panned out, but there's a small portion where Captain America, or a small run where Captain America becomes an agent of Hydra. I think he has like the Hydra symbol instead of the stars and stripes. It's just a really cool reference to the comics with that. The other thing is, a lot of people were wondering, is Bucky going to become the new Captain America? Because again, in the comics, and there's a lot of comic references. I mean, what do you expect? It's a comic book movie. Whether or not Falcon or Bucky, the Winter Soldier, is going to become the new Captain America, because both of them do that in the comics. What I expected to happen, or the choice that was made complete sense to me, and it wasn't Winter Soldier, it wasn't Bucky, because even though he'd been brainwashed and he's secretly a good guy, and they kind of got all that out of him finally, and he's on the good side, he still did a lot of bad stuff. He killed Tony's parents. He's killed countless numbers of people for the government. And if that kind of thing ever got out as the new Captain America, it's not going to be a good look for them. So clearly that was never really going to be a choice. So by default, Falcon got the nod. And there's a scene towards the end of the film where Captain America hands off his shield to Falcon and essentially says, you're the guy now. You're the new Captain America. The reason he does that, and the last point that I'll make about Steve Rogers in this film, is Steve actually can't be Captain America anymore. The reason why he can't be Captain America anymore is, by the end of this film, Captain America is no longer the Steve Rogers that you see in this shot right here. The young, tone Captain America. He's an old, decrepit war veteran, basically. I'd have to say he's probably 75, 80 years old. Now, how that happens is a really cool scene where they have to return all the Infinity Stones to the original timeline, as I mentioned. They're going into this scene thinking that Captain America is going to jump back in time, return the Infinity Stones, and come right back. Well, he does that. Problem is, he does come back. He doesn't get trapped in the past. I thought maybe they're going to set up a second movie, or they're going to spin off some kind of movie, to maybe have somewhere they could go with Captain America after this, because he didn't come back right away. But when he comes back, he doesn't come back through their time travel technology. They look over and they see this old man sitting on a bench. He's sitting on a bench by the lake. He's just kind of minding his own business. And as Bucky and Falcon approach him, they realize that it's Steve. This is Steve, and he's aged probably 5 decades. Essentially what happened is Steve jumped back in time in order to return the Infinity Stones. Now, whether this was part of his plan all along, or whether it's something that just happened along the way, he ends up staying in the past. He actually somehow is able to return the Infinity Stones to their original timeline and then jump even further back into the past, into the original timeline of the 1940s, where he's able to finally get back with Peggy Carter. He's able to essentially live the life he's always wanted to live. So he just stays in the past, and he ages normally up until the events of the end of Endgame, where he's an old man, which is why he gives his shield to Falcon, and they have to come up with a new Captain America. So instead of just killing him off, but also wanting to kind of end that line of Captain America and Iron Man films, they kill Tony, and then they don't want to kill Captain America on top of that, so they kind of age him out of it, which I thought was a really good way to do that. It not only ties up or frees up Chris Evans so he can kind of move on from the Marvel films, which I know he's done with now, but it also, the character itself is able to finally get some closure and not be this tragic figure in the Marvel series, because he had his one love, Peggy Carter. That's all he wanted in life, is just to have a girl that he can dance with, and that's exactly how the film ends. He's dancing with her. Well, that's not how. Does it end that way? I'm trying to think. Is that the last scene? Because there's a funeral scene, and then I think there's a scene in the 40s with Captain America and Peggy Carter. So I'm not exactly sure how those pan out. But the point is, it's a really great way that they wrap that up. It's poignant, and for everybody that's wanting to finally see Steve be truly happy, you're going to get it in this film. Okay, so we have to talk about the final item on our list. And if you've been with the stream this long, I appreciate it. And if you're just joining us, be sure to go back and watch the full top 10 list, where we run down our top 10 most shocking reveals from Avengers Endgame. But I've saved the one of the most shocking things until last, which has to do with the end credit sequences for the film. Now, I have to say, I was surprised at how Marvel handled this film. Now, if you think back to the earliest days of the Marvel film, I'm pretty sure, if I'm not mistaken, Nick Fury kicks off this trend in the very first Iron Man film. So I'm sitting there in the theater with everybody else, and the first kind of area of the credits where the sequence is normally going to come in, it doesn't happen. Usually what they do is they'll have a small credit sequence. They'll give us kind of the first kind of post-credit sequence or scene. Then they'll have the rest of the credits, which is like 10, 15 minutes long. Then at the very end, of course, we have our main scene that sets up something else. So we didn't have anything at the beginning of the credits. The theater and I sat through the entire credit sequence, and we get to the end. Now, here is the shocking part. I was very shocked to see what came up on the screen at the end. Probably as shocked as you were if you've seen the film. So it goes to black. The credits are over. We see the Marvel logo. And that's it. There were no 0.0 after credit scenes. Now, I know I wasn't the only one shocked at that, because I had a whole theater of people sitting there with me that were just as... We were all kind of dumbstruck by that, except for one guy. There was actually a guy sitting right next to me, because it was a packed theater, and you didn't really have... I couldn't do the normal thing where we, try to get some seats with some space in between us. So me and this guy are literally sitting like shoulder to shoulder. As soon as the film went off and the first credits rolled, he jumped up and left immediately. So he clearly knew something I didn't. He must have looked it up like before he came in, because I remember he got up and I looked and I'm like, what is this guy doing? Like, doesn't he know where he is? This is a Marvel movie. You know there's going to be something at the end of the credits. Nope. We got nothing. Not a single thing. Well, we got one little thing, which we will talk about. But first, I want to talk about why I am completely and 100% okay with that decision. While I get that that has become a fun novelty and almost expected by all Marvel fans, myself included, I will never leave a Marvel film before the credits are done just to make sure I don't miss anything. I even started doing that for other movies, like completely unrelated films, like romantic comedies. I'll sit there and I'll think, should I sit through the credits? What if they show a scene at the end? And sometimes DC films do it. So I'm not really sure what the new standard is. So I get paranoid. I'm like, I can't just jump up and leave. I might miss something. But with this film, they took 10 years of Marvel movies that they have been setting up one after another and slowly but surely laying this foundation. And with Endgame, they wrap up things so perfectly as far as this specific saga is concerned. Of course, there's going to be more Marvel films. That's not the point. The point is, with this set of movies, it made sense to tease and continue to set up the next film and the next film. If they had tagged it with anything at this point, even though I was curious to see what it was, and I'm kind of excited for an end credit sequence, and I want to see what was going to happen, I'm kind of glad that they didn't, because there was really nothing else they needed to do. I am completely satisfied with this film and the journey that Marvel has taken me on for 10 years. So if you are one of the people that are just pissed off or, aggravated that they didn't do more, they didn't keep up with tradition, just remember that, as Tony says, the ending is as much of the journey as the beginning. And it's time that this chapter of the Marvel Cinematic Universe came to a close, and it's perfect. Now, there was one thing at the end that I'm glad that they included. There's a sound over the shot of the Marvel logo. There's a sound of this hammer banging on this anvil. And I was thinking to myself, what is that? I thought maybe, was that something to do with Thor and Thor's hammer or something? And the lady next to me, as she was getting up to leave, she said, I think that's the sound of the sound Tony is making in the first film when he's building his original, Mark I armor in the cave when he's just trying to escape the terrorist. And as I was driving home, I was thinking about that, and I thought to myself, what a perfect way for this to end. Now, when Tony does the third snap, he says the same thing that he said in the first film. He literally says the words, I am Iron Man. And then the film ends with the sound of Tony hammering out his armor. That's perfect to me. Because if it was not for Robert Downey Jr., and also a big shout out to Jon Favreau, who I don't feel gets enough credit. If that first Iron Man film did not work, make no mistake, you would not have a Marvel Cinematic Universe. You would have just had a bad comic book movie that nobody took serious, maybe a sequel, maybe not, but you would not have had the empire that this grew into if that first film did not work. If you think back to the kind of the early to mid 2000s, if you were to ask somebody on the street to name a superhero character, they're going to go with Batman or Superman. Those are the go-tos. Those are the number ones. And then if you say, no, name a Marvel character, the average person back then is not even going to know the difference. If you're someone in the know, if you follow, comic books or gaming or that kind of thing, yeah, you probably know. But the average person on the street at that time couldn't even tell you the difference between Marvel characters and DC characters. And if they did, more likely than not, they're going to name an X-Man, they're going to name Wolverine, they're going to name Fantastic Four or Spider-Man. They're not going to say a D-list character like Iron Man, who didn't even, you weren't buying Iron Man action figures off the shelf in 2004, 2005. It was Robert Downey Jr. and the success of that first film that created all of this. These figures on my shelf behind me, this hat, this Marvel shirt, that was the house that Iron Man built. That was the work of Jon Favreau. Again, props to him. Robert Downey Jr., who took a character that I don't think anybody cared about, really. I mean, Iron Man can be a cool character, but Robert Downey Jr. made Tony Stark interesting. He made Tony Stark something that people wanted to be. Tony Stark became more popular than Iron Man ever has. And that's that credit goes to that first film. So the fact that they chose to end it in the same way that it began, perfect. That is exactly how it should have ended. And I cannot say enough to Marvel. Thank you for the journey. And we'll see you next time.